gentlemen, this is Redberryweo here, and welcome back to another Civil Air Patrol video. As part of Thanksgiving, because this video is being posted on Thanksgiving, I wanted to give you guys a little gift of creating a summary video of Module 4, Chapter 1 from the Aerospace Dimensions series. And so if you are not familiar with what that is the series of books that Phase 1 and Phase 2 cadets are required to study in order to pass their aerospace tests. And then in Phase 3 and Phase 4, it's the Journey of Flight books. So with this one, I really want to dive deep with this section because there's a lot of history within rockets. And this is what this module is about. It's about rockets. And the first chapter of it is about the history. And from what I've seen with some of the new milestone tests, some of these questions can be very, very specific. And I'm not studying for you, but I want to provide this additional resource of highlighting here are the important dates, and here are names and things that are associated with each other that you should really know that relationship exists, because it'll help when you're taking your milestone tests. And the milestone test that I'm referring to is the Mitchell. The aerospace portion is a requirement for getting your Mitchell. Hopefully with this video resource, you will be prepared, and if you're taking just the Module 4 for one of your achievements, it's good to use this as a little bit of a review after you've used your SQ3R technique, which is survey, question, read, recall, review, right? Because that's something we learned in the Learn to Lead book. Yes? Yes. So let's talk about the history of rockets. And something I do want to mention is at the very beginning of the chapter, it always has a list of terms. While these terms are always good to study, don't just study the terms section. There's a lot of information within the chapter itself that you do need to be familiar with when you take your tests or when you're completing the cadet interactive modules, because the cadet interactive modules are a thing too now. So please keep that in mind while you are taking the requirements to complete your aerospace portion of your achievement. So the history and the origin of rockets is about 400 BC. Archytas, a Greek, created a wooden pigeon suspended by a wire that was powered by steam. And about 300 years later, a guy named Hero came along and he created the first rocket engine. And it was also steam powered, where it had like a little sphere, there was fire, there was water, and the sphere had little things on it so that it could move because of the steam. And this was like the first time that someone had created a rocket engine. And if you want to experience something similar to what Hero had developed, there is an activity at the end of the chapter that you can investigate. And in the 1st century AD, the Chinese created these gunpowder-filled tubes of bamboo, attached them to arrows, and used them as fireworks for like religious and festive celebrations and activities, which was really cool. And in about 1232, the Chinese and the Mongols were at war with each other, and the Chinese used rockets to fight against the Mongols. And here's the first major name of someone in the chapter. It's Roger Bacon. He's from England, and he increased the range of the gunpowder by experimenting with it and testing different materials to make something that was more effective than what already existed. And then the second name is Jean Fraser, and he's from France, and he actually created the precursor of the bazooka by trying to increase the accuracy of rockets. And there's the second activity at the end of this chapter where you can take a look and kind of see what he did. And Sir Isaac Newton is the third important person here in this chapter, where he laid out the laws of motion. And we haven't quite gone over that yet, but that will be coming up in the second chapter overview of this module. Okay, and our fourth person is William Congreve, and he actually extended the rocket's firing range from 200 yards to 3,000 yards. And it's a historical fun fact, the rockets that were launching in the air above Fort McHenry that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner were those same rockets that Congreve had developed. So despite all of these advancements with rockets, there hadn't been much to improve the accuracy of them, and people were like, well, we should do something about that. And so a guy who addressed this challenge was William Hale, And so he created the spin stabilization technique, which is something that's used pretty frequently now in different variations, but it's essentially where the rocket spins as if it were like a bullet. And so it goes, wee. Well, not like, it doesn't say that, but it spins very quickly trying to establish a accurate trajectory and allow people to kind of pick their target and actually try to get to it rather than being like, well, let's see what happens and just kind of letting it launch and not knowing where it's going to go. And leaning into modern rocketry, Konstantin Soylovsky was a Russian who kind of created the foundation and is known as the father of modern astronautics, where there were three big things. He proposed that rockets could be used for space travel. He suggested that there should be a use of fluid or liquid propellants, which is different from what had previously been done with the gunpowder, which is not a liquid, it's a solid. Solid came before liquid. And Soylovsky's third thing was that he said that the exhaust velocity was the thing that limited the range and the speed of the rocket. And so because of these things, he is known as the father of modern astronautics. Then along came Goddard. His name was Dr. Robert Goddard, and you may know him because one of the achievements is named after him, and he is known as the father of modern rocketry. And that is because of the enormous developments that he had throughout his career involving rockets. And in the early 20th century, Dr. Goddard had a bunch of different experiments involving rockets that really propelled it forward. Good pun, good pun. And so he at first started doing stuff with solid fuel, but then he was like, no, it's got to be liquid. We got to try liquid and see what we can do from there. And so in 1926, he used a combination of liquid oxygen and gasoline to create a liquid propellant for a rocket, and it was that successful test that showed him that you could really use liquids in order to effectively propel a rocket. And I do want you to look at your book more in depth on the composition of the Goddard rocket, but I also have this little diagram here, and I'm looking at my screen here to make sure that I'm saying all this correctly. But there's a lot to his rocket that kind of differed from other rockets. Like, he created a compartment system, so if you wanted to put something in the rocket, you could. He also tried to create flight control systems and ways to recover rockets by having a parachute system so that it would shoot up and then it would come down gently without being destroyed upon landing on the Earth. And so this is a really cool diagram, and I do highly recommend looking through it. But this is something that someone created just based off of his understanding of physics and his ability to take what was previously generated and adding more and contributing to rocketry in that way. And as another small tidbit of history, in 1923 there was a man named Hermann Oberg from Germany who created a book saying that rockets should be used in space. And so this kind of inspired people to really start thinking about small rockets being used across the world, and this contributed to the development of several major rockets, including the V2. And so here's a little bit more information about Wernher von Braun, the guy who created the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket was a warhead that was actually used during World War II. Later on, it was effective, but it wasn't early enough in the war to really change the outcome. And it was effective in destroying city blocks in London, which was really unfortunate. And after the war, Wernher von Braun got recruited into the US to lead the rocketry program. In 1957, a Soviet scientist named Sergei Korolev created the first Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile that was successful. And he also was involved with the first artificial satellite called Sputnik 1, and you probably have already heard of Sputnik, but yeah, Sputnik was a big deal because it was the first out of any artificial satellites to be sent to space. So he is considered to be the father of the Soviet space program. So because of Sputnik, and because of there being some tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, there was something called the space race, which was basically trying to get dominance of the space above the Earth. And by doing technological advancements with scientists and research, the Soviet Union and the United States were at odds with each other, trying to be like the first one to really have a presence up there. On January 31st, 1958, Explorer 1, which was a US satellite, was the first one to actually recognize the Van Allen radiation belt. Not too long later, in October of 1958, the United States actually founded NASA, which is also known as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you all at once right here, with a lot of names, dates, and accomplishments. So please write these things down because you probably will see these on a milestone test, at least one of them. April 1961, Yuri Gagarin was the first man to orbit the Earth. This is not to be confused with John Glenn, who orbited the Earth in 1962, and he was an American. Okay, so he was the first American to orbit the Earth, but it was Yuri Gagarin who was the first man to orbit Earth. Okay? And Alan Shepard was the first American in space, and that was about a month after Yuri had orbited the Earth. Both John Glenn and Alan Shepard used Mercury capsules, and with John Glenn, he went on the Friendship 7, and with Alan Shepard, he went on the Freedom 7. For a bit, the US went and explored through different options for unmanned flight, kind of testing the water to see what steps would be required in order to get from the Earth all the way to the moon. And that's because JFK had his speech kind of inspiring the country that we need to set a man on the moon. And this is a very famous speech that you could always look up and watch on your own. What they did was they came up with this staging system so that one propellant would get it to a certain point and then something else would provide an additional boost and keep pushing it further and further ahead so that it would eventually be able to reach the moon. Then the next step in the US's space progression was that they created the Gemini program from 1965 to 1966. In Gemini, you gotta think of twins. You think of two people. It's also got two eyes at the very end. Remember, Gemini, two people in the capsule. And they basically practice rendezvous and docking procedures with these capsules as practice in preparation for the next step, which was the Apollo missions. And the Apollo missions are the most well-known, well, because of them actually landing on the moon, but we'll get to that. But it's a progression. The Apollo mission, which was the three-manned, so Apollo 3, it went from 1967 to 1975. And so it started with Apollo 7, and Apollo 11 was the one that actually successfully landed on the moon. And it was Neil Armstrong who was the first man to walk on the moon. And the next step was creating the first US space station, known as Skylab. Skylab was launched in May of 1973, and it wasn't there for very long. It actually had a relatively short lifespan from between 1973 and 1974, where the longest mission, it says here, was 84 days, which, if you look at some of the missions now of people going to the International Space Station, some of them are there for a significantly longer amount of time. Then the next step was the Shuttle Transport System, which is known as the STS or the Space Shuttles. And there are actually quite a few of them scattered in different areas across the country, so if you want to go see one, you probably can. And they're all grounded, they're not being used actively anymore because the program actually ended. And the point of it was that it was actually shaped similarly to a plane so that it could decelerate after it came through the atmosphere and land safely in the ocean for the crew to be picked up and taken back. And while that is the end of the chapter, know that there are lots of additional advancements happening right now, especially with companies like SpaceX, Lockheed Martin working together with NASA and other organizations to really try to increase the chances of space exploration and going beyond just the moon, but going to Mars and doing further exploration deeper in our solar system. So just know that there are activities at the end of the chapter to reinforce whatever concepts you would like to learn a little bit more about through a hands-on activity. Hands-on learning is pretty effective in terms of a retention technique, so maybe pair the information you learn from activity 1 on Hero's engine, and you'll be able to remember that for your milestone test when you take it a year or two from now. or whenever you take it. I'm not sure when you will take it, but that is all. So that is the end of this video. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and that is all, folks. Until next time, toodles.